I have a question for you. The questions on my file, the comprehensive.
All right.
Will the questions be the same questions that were on our previous quizzes or tests, or will you have new questions over the same material?
There will be some questions that have been on previous exams for the final, and there will be some questions that are, well, there'll be new questions from the material since the third exam. There will be some questions that will be new questions on previous material, and then there will be some questions that you'll have seen before.
Study guide from you?
On study guide 4, if I remember correctly, it should have not only what the material since the third exam, but the specifics of the previous study guides. What I want you to know from Judaism, Hinduism, all of those. I believe I divided it that way. And then also, don't forget that there will be only one essay question on the final. You won't have a choice, but that essay question is on the study guide. Right? So that question will appear on the exam. That leads me into reminding you that a lot of the essays look really good. A lot of people chose to do the one about new religious movement. But what happened was there were parts of the question that you forgot, or I asked for multiple things and you gave me one. So make sure in looking over that essay question for the final, and we'll talk about it next Tuesday. Tuesday we'll use as a review session next week. But make sure in going over that question that you understand what I'm looking for, right? And so if it says 5 components, make sure you know 5 components, right? And if especially on the essay exam, not only do I want you to list, but I also want you to provide me specific examples from religions. So one component of religion, for example, would be ritual. And so, defining religion, right? One of the components of religion is ritual. The essay question, I want you to give me 2 examples of rituals from specific religions, right? And so I want you to talk about, whether that's Hanukkah from Judaism, Bhakti from Hinduism, right? So make sure you go through that question, you understand what I'm looking for, and you address all of that in your answer. And like I said, we'll talk about that again next Tuesday. But just as you're preparing and thinking about it, keep that in mind. The exam is 2 weeks from today at 10 o'clock. So a little bit earlier than we meet. Obviously, there won't be chapel that week. So 2 weeks from today, that is the 26th at 10 o'clock. You have an hour and 50 minutes to take it, so it'll be probably a little bit longer than the normal tests we've been having, but pretty much the same format. Right? There'll be some short answer, there'll be some multiple choice, and then of course the essay. Any other questions about the current exam? Remember to double check my math. I might have made some mistakes. Each of the short answer and the multiple choice were worth 2 points, and then the essay was out of 30 points.
How about just completing all the essays?
It is 20 points. Right? So if you did all the reflective essays, you get your top 4 will be the basis for it, and then 20 extra points. There is another one due this Thursday, so there's another reflective essay due this Thursday. So don't forget to complete that, and there are still, there was a reading quiz today and a reading quiz for Thursday. I think there is a reading for next Tuesday. I think there's 3 more reading quizzes. So there was one for today, one for Thursday, and then one for Tuesday. But most of the time on Tuesday we'll be using as a review session. Any other questions, either about the exam or about what's coming up? Okay, we were in the midst of talking about atheism there were a couple of things that I wanted to finish up with regarding atheism before moving on to talking about religion and popular culture. And so we'll talk about religion and popular culture today, and then on Thursday we'll talk about religion and globalization. As we finished up last Thursday, we were talking about the appeal of atheism. What is it that is drawing people to atheism? Things like how political religion has gotten in, especially the United States, but in Western Europe as well. How it appears to be more rational and scientific, that is how it's presented, as well as the failures of religious people. And one of the ways that we've seen this is what's called the rise of the nones, those that are identifying themselves as being of no religion or having no religious preference when it comes to particular polls or surveys. A lot of those are not atheists. They do have some sort of spiritual beliefs, but are choosing to not identify with a specific religious tradition and traditional expression of religion, but still believing in some aspects of spirituality, but not definable religion. One of the last things, well, there's a couple of things that I want to think about as we finish off talking about atheism. One is the major question. All right, does God exist? Now, I know probably for most of us the question is pretty settled in our minds, one way or the other. Probably most of us believing that God exists. But when faced with the issue of atheism, of course, as it being a legitimate option for a lot of people, I think it's important every so often to think about what is it that could lead us to a reasonable conclusion that God exists in the universe. Now, one thing I want to talk about here is that there are certain aspects of Christianity that cannot be determined through reason. It does not seem reasonable, for example, that God would send His Son to die on a cross for our sins. If we were rationally trying to make that decision, that's not the decision we would make. There's something larger, what we would call faith, that accomplishes certain traditions or beliefs within Christianity. But is there a legitimate philosophical, logical, rational way to talk about God's existence that does not necessarily appeal to revelation, right? That we solely rely on the Bible? Throughout the past couple of centuries, from the later Middle Ages to the present, there have been a variety of people who have tried to lay down rationalistic or logical or philosophical, we can approach it in different ways, proofs for the existence of God. And probably ones that you've heard of, you're aware of, things like the cosmological argument. Right? The idea that every effect has a cause. And so there must be, there's not an infinite series of causes, there must have been an original first cause. Then there's the teleological argument, which is sometimes referred to as the argument from design. The universe exhibits design, so there must be a designer. So there are other proofs that people have used throughout history. Often, the so-called proofs for the existence of God are only proving God's existence to the faithful. Right? Somebody that already believes in God is going to have their faith strengthened by some of these proofs. And atheists and other philosophers have offered significant counter-arguments to these proofs throughout history. But there's still, in many respects, a lot of things that we can think of coming from, again, from a place of faith as to how these proofs might be useful. There is a minister named Timothy Keller, who's from the Reformed Presbyterian tradition, who in his book, The Reason for God, offers some things that I think are useful to think about. But he refers to these as clues for the existence of God. He doesn't talk about them as proof. Because in many respects, if God truly wanted to prove himself, he is not doing a good job of it. Because we can, even as Christians, doubt God's existence. So God doesn't overwhelm us with proof. But he does offer us clues that perhaps provide us a foundation from which we can have faith. And a lot of them are very similar to the traditional proofs for the existence of God. When we think about our universe, or we think about our existence in this world, everything in this world is contingent. We are not necessary beings. We do not exist because we must exist. We exist because a male and a female copulated, creating an embryo which was born, and it's us. And so there's nothing in our identity that is necessary. You don't exist because you had to exist. I don't exist because I had to exist. The trees, the flowers, buildings, right, all come from somewhere else, which came from somewhere else, which came from somewhere else. If that's the case for all that we see in the world, is it not reasonable or possible that the entire world itself is contingent? Right? Depending upon something else for its existence. Why wouldn't the universe be contingent when everything else in it is? Now, that doesn't prove that the Christian God exists, but it does suggest that there is a possibility that there must be something or someone outside of the universe that's responsible for the universe. Often in talking about the design argument, people will talk about the ways in which the universe exhibits design. And we'll talk about the intricacies of the human body and the way in which the heavens and other things exhibit design. Now, of course, a lot of people coming from a naturalistic point or an atheistic point would say, you know, we're seeing design, it's not really there. But when we think about the constants in our universe that are necessary for life to exist, the constants of gravity, certain aspects of physics, etc., do they demonstrate chaos or do they demonstrate design? From the naturalistic argument, the argument would be, we exist because it just so happened that the characteristics for life to exist were met. And so it just happened that we have the right amount of oxygen in our air. The Earth spins at the right speed. It's at the right distance from the sun. It's at the right... So all of these things just happen to be life providing or life possibilities. But when we think about how that really works out, there are other places where we would say, you know, I don't think that's true. I mean, let's assume for a second that multitudes of universes potentially exist, and this just happens to be the universe where life exists on Earth. Well, imagine you were playing poker with someone. Not that you should play poker for money. But imagine you were playing poker with someone. And 20 times in a row, they dealt themselves 4 aces. 20 times in a row. Would you accept that there are an infinite number of universes that exist, and it just happens that we're in the universe where he dealt himself 4 aces 20 times in a row? Would you accept that as a legitimate explanation for why he gets 4 aces 20 times in a row? You say, no, you're cheating. We wouldn't accept that as an answer. How about 50 skilled marksmen shooting to execute someone 6 feet away, and they all miss? Would you accept the possibility that there's an infinite number of universes, and it just so happens in this one, they all missed? Or would you assume that there is some sort of conspiracy to explain why this person was not executed? Most of us would say, right, they've got to be working together. Again, it doesn't overwhelmingly prove God exists, but it does provide us a reasonable point to say maybe there's something more than just chance that explains the constants of gravity, the makeup of physics, other aspects of the life-giving nature of the planet, let alone the universe. How about our senses? For a lot of people, our senses indicate that there is something out there, that there is a God. When you think about the number of people, billions of people in the world, our senses seem to indicate there is a God. It's very easy as a concept for human beings to grasp a God who is a creator. Now, if we were taking a totally naturalistic approach, we would have to say that our sense belief that there is a God is something that evolved that makes us better suited as a species for survival. And so our belief in God is something that evolved and makes us better as a species to survive. But if we can't trust our senses to tell us the truth about God, why trust them about anything? Atheists assume our senses are wrong about God. But how can we be sure that our senses are right about science, about reason? But we do tend to trust our senses, so wouldn't that indicate that perhaps there was a God who made us in such a way that we can most of the time, all things being equal, trust our senses? There are other things that we could talk about related to morality, related to aesthetics, that again, don't totally prove God's existence. And if you're relying solely on what your reason can determine to prove God's existence, to prove the existence of the Christian God, you will find yourself lacking. But there is enough in our universe, there is enough in our brains that would lead us reasonably to a conclusion that something somewhere exists outside of this universe. Not totally convincing, but enough that I think we can say it doesn't have to be something irreasonable or illogical to believe in God. Another thing that I think is important for us to recognize that we talked about last time just briefly, there are certain things that science cannot explain. One of them being the supernatural. If we solely rely on science to tell us whether or not God exists, we will not answer that question. We might answer the question to our own satisfaction, but that doesn't truly answer the question. Because science by itself cannot answer the question of whether or not something supernatural exists. It can answer the question of whether something supernatural can be observed. If something happens, is this supernatural or is there an explanation? That could be, right? I mean, we think about how our ancestors might have seen comets and thought they were supernatural warnings. But science can explain what a comet is. But science by that cannot explain whether or not there is a supernatural. Because it is unable to address that issue. But on the other hand, we have to realize, especially for those of us that are Christians, that a lot of what we believe as Christians is based on faith and not necessarily science. That's not a bad thing, but it does mean that we can't just assume certain faith ideas that non-Christians are going to accept. But the faith in something isn't necessarily itself irrational. Furthermore, there are certain things within science itself, or a naturalistic approach itself, that are based on faith, not science. For example, the idea that reason itself is the best way to discover truth. How do you reasonably determine that reason is the best way to discover truth? Isn't that kind of circular? You have to use your reason. If you use your reason, you discover truth. But how do you know that your reason is telling you the truth? And so you have this kind of circular logic that is just as circular for faith as it is for certain things. And so what is relied on is a belief in the process. Again, it's not a bad thing, but it is one of the things that kind of gets obscured. One aspect of this that I want to finally leave with this question. A French philosopher in, I believe it's the 18th century, named Blaise Pascal, talked about how it was better to live as if God exists. On the one hand, Pascal argued, if you believe that God exists and live appropriately, and you die, and you're wrong, nothing happens. You're dead. You're gone. That's it. If, however, you live as God doesn't exist, and you die, and you find out you're wrong, there is great consequences to that. Now again, Pascal's wager is just that philosophical point. But it does help us, I think, understand as Christians how important it is that we live faithfully to what we believe, even if we recognize how much of it is on faith and not anything we can prove beyond reasonable doubt.